I'm Roger Robinson, author of When Running Made History and other books, and I'm here today at the kind invitation of Will Sanchez to sit in his rightful chair and once again talk to somebody with a real accomplishment and interest in the history of running. And today it is Pam Cooper. Pam, welcome.
Thank you.
To this fascinating program. Always interesting to get to talk to significant people. Pamela is a runner, a writer. She's written for Runner's World and for the Journal of Sports History with that very nice mix of the popular and the academic. Mainly a historian with a PhD from the University of Maine. And most of all, we know her as the author of one of the best and most significant books about the history of running, The American Marathon, published by Syracuse University Press in their very distinguished sports history series. Pamela, let's start with how the book began, and because this brings you in personally as well as the book. You say in the introduction, the idea of this book was born one autumn day in 1983 when John J. Kelly, Amby Burfoot, and I visited a little square in Stanford, Connecticut, and looked for the plaque that marked the starting line of the first American marathon. Pam, tell us about that visit and about that first marathon.
Well, about the visit, I was disappointed that people didn't make more fuss about the origins of the marathon. I was interested in it. Amby Burfoot certainly encouraged me on doing the history. And of course, John J. Kelly had a biography that I found fascinating. But there was so much more to write, and there was just nothing. And I had done some research in college. I'd finished my degree in 1983 at Bard College, and I'd done some research on it. I was encouraged by my advisor, Mario Bick. And I realized somewhere along the line that this was, I don't know, my calling, but I was going to continue researching the history of the marathon foot race. Everybody saw this. When it was just a marathon in Central Park, not too many people watched, and they could just say to themselves, crazy runners taking up the park. Now it was out on the streets, and you see it, it's just so inspiring to see a marathon, to see that first runner coming in, looking so small, and then he passes you and you realize how fast he's running. It's a tremendous statement about human spirit, and it makes you want to do it too. Lebo knew this. Now, the first marathon, Stanford, Connecticut to Columbia Oval in the Bronx, run by J.J. McDermott, who also won the first Boston Marathon, and mostly middle-class young men who were part of running clubs. But that ended the marathon in New York City. I think the athletic establishment really didn't know how to take it in, what to do with it. It was kind of an outlier event. Remember, it was an exhibit event, an exhibition game, kind of like a torch run for the first Olympics.
So that was just after the first Olympics, wasn't it?
That was just after.
And so it was in fact
1896.
Yeah, so our viewers have got it. It was before the first Boston Marathon,
yes,
which
it
of
was.
course then did take off, unlike the New York one. They did try and revive it. About 20 years ago, my wife Catherine Switzer and I did the television commentary on the Stanford Marathon. They had TV there. I remember the broadcast was rather ruined by the insistence of a big cop riding right in front of the field the whole time on his motorcycle, and so he was he was up front in every camera shot. But and then it didn't go anywhere. I think it just went for the 1 year. But that was really good that you got that and showed that the history started there in Connecticut and New York rather than in Boston, which people tend to think. Your book is so interesting about the social makeup of the marathon. And that really is its main contribution, I think, as a work of history. You say this just about the way the marathon started and the way it appealed to people who were beginning to work in the new kind of industrialized corporate jobs, which took them a long way away from the real world of agriculture. Because white-collar positions in corporations, you say, trapped men in routine and hierarchy and separated them from each other and from physical work. Middle-class men asserted their autonomy and physical individuality in sport among their peers. And I found that a really interesting statement about why sport began when it did.
Well, this is when basketball was invented, you know, for these men for exactly that purpose. And so middle-class men wanted these organized sports. Most social trends begin with the middle class or the upper class, and they drift down to the working class. And that's pretty much what happened with the marathon. The marathon in New York ended with that one, and then it came back in 1907 when there was more interest. And you remember, until Frank Shorter won the Olympic marathon in 1972, the interest in the marathon occurred once every 4 years, and then everybody forgot about it.
Except in Boston.
Yes, Boston, where it continued. Boston's quite interesting because you had the Boston Athletic Association putting on the marathon, starting, you know, in 1897, but the people who ran in it were working class, and it remained a working class event. And when it came back to New York in 1907, it was very definitely a working class event.
You say something that I've not seen anywhere else about the distinction between New York and Boston as a kind of locus for the marathon, and that is that New York really benefited from the fact that it didn't have a continuous marathon. You know, Boston, year after year after year ago. And you make the point that tended to make Boston, certainly as late as the 1960s and even 70s, very conservative. So it really didn't change much. And people who ran Boston have always said just how crazy it was that they used to get the split times at every railway station, you know, which was at whatever, 5.5 miles and 9.75 miles or something. And the split times meant nothing except by comparison with previous years at Boston. Whereas New York, you say, there was one in 1896 and another in 1907, and then they tended to come and die away and come and die away. And so therefore, they could kind of regenerate and modernize each time it was revived.
Yes, it could be the latest thing in sport. It could be a new thing. It could attract a new constituency every time. And you did have changes in ethnic representation, but always the working class.
Yeah, and that, of course, that applies really that when New York came again in 1970, and that year they added women, and then only 6 years later, it was the bicentenary, and they went out into the streets. And so, yes, that race was reinventing the whole sport.
It was, as you said, Boston was conservative. This is how we do it. We have the Boston Marathon, and it's put on by this group over this route. But New York didn't really have kind of a dominant class that was running the marathon. It was the people ran it. What the point, and I think the theme of the book, which was to me most important, was Boston established a foot race. New York City created a marathon culture.
Oh, that's a really interesting way of putting it. Well, that raises another point, which is still true of the sport of running by comparison with most other sports, and that is that it is almost entirely a participant sport. We've got big numbers in running now. They're not as big as the numbers that follow baseball or football, but the huge majority of those are spectators, whereas the huge majority in our sport are participants. And that was the case right from the start, wasn't it?
Yes, but I really want to argue with you about that. It's a participant sport. The spectators are also participants. In the marathon, they are right there, They're not up in the stands, and especially the New York City participants, the spectators. That was a Freudian slip, that should stand. The spectator is a participant. When you run the New York City Marathon, anyone will tell you get so much from the crowds, and the crowds know it. And there are people who volunteer year after year to hand out water. They're not spectators, they are participants.
Yeah, you're right, and that's what creates that overall culture that you talked about. And Fred Lebow said anything for a T-shirt, meaning people would help and volunteer at the race. And actually, I do say that in my book, When Running Made History. I used a column that I'd written for Runner's World or Running Times about spectators and saying they're the most neglected part of the running community.
They are part of the marathon, and it wouldn't be the same without them, and we need them there.
And we do nothing for them. Not even give them toilets or information. You wrote a chapter in your book called New York City Marathon Culture. Would you read the opening paragraph of it for us, please? It's page 27, I think.
This is about where we are in the history.
Yes.
The marathon foot race returned to the New York City area in 1907 to be claimed by a new sport constituency. After 10 years, the race had evolved into a sport with mostly working class participants. It was public, boisterous, and earthy. Runners passed close by the spectators, streaming with sweat, their labored breathing clearly audible as they kicked through the dust of the roads. The marathon gave ethnic groups a way to participate in patriotic celebrations by watching representative sports as the middle class did, but on working class terms. John Bodner explains that, quote, immigrants sought to enter capitalist society on their own terms and formulate their own definition of their status and condition. And that's what they did in the marathon. The immigrant groups entered on their own terms. They represented themselves as hyphenated Americans and most of the working class at this time. And I had a wonderful time at the New York City Library, happiest place on earth, researching this. And I would go through lists and look at the last names and cross-reference and get the ethnicities. And I would cross-reference, you know, I was in the tabloids going through and figuring out. And these were Irish Americans and Italian Americans and African Americans and Jewish Americans. It took me quite a while to figure out who were the African Americans, but Gary Corbett and I have discussed that, and they were participants, and they were representing their ethnic groups in an American celebration.
Still happens.
Yes.
You know, I put a special section into my book about Meb Keflezighi.
Yes.
And about him as the absolute model, the typical model of the immigrant who came in with nothing and a big family, and now every one of those 10 siblings, except for Meb himself, have got higher degrees and are contributing to society as lawyers and doctors. And Meb says he has a PhD in running. They're very able people. And yeah, it's exactly that. And running gives, as it were, a non-threatening context in which they can succeed. Yeah, I wanted people to hear actually part of your text rather than just the ideas of the book, important though those are, because that's a fine, vivid piece of writing which actually brings the whole sport to life. So yeah, that's what running history makes it so fascinating, is that the historical generalizations are all based on this actual process which we all relate to, and everybody watching this program loves to start with. Okay, that mainly working class in those early years, the beginning of the century. Yes. Mainly blue-collar sport, and that certainly fits with the people I knew in England in my boyhood, who were running cross-country mostly. I used to mix with, and they were in the Midlands and north of England. They were the Arias, as people call them, and it was not a private school sport. But then it began to change. And to simplify your book considerably, 2/3 of it is what you might call a story of increasing inclusiveness.
Yes.
So different groups, and you've just spoken very well about the immigrant groups coming and making it an activity of their own. But gradually the sport expanded until it now reached the point when it's become, as I just tried to say by using Meb as an example, really a paragon, a model of inclusiveness in an age when that concept is being challenged again. And so running, I think, is arguably very important, perhaps more important than it's ever been. And your story becomes a very important one. I'm interested because there's a chapter in my book about the Cold War. And
Yes.
I was very interested in what you have to say about the Cold War. And I'd never thought of this before. You use the term the gentrification of the marathon, which
Okay. That,
means the college boys coming in and beginning to run
yes.
it. Not taking it over, but becoming part of the scene.
Well, part of it was the culture of the 60s, you know, when you didn't need anything. The 60s were an age when you could live on very little. We didn't have stagflation yet. Part of it was the economy. You could get a job, you could live on very little, and almost a hippie ideal would be the runner who lived on practically nothing and devoted himself to becoming better and better at the marathon.
For nothing, without making any money out of it.
Without
We have
making
to
any money,
remind people of
yes.
that date there was
Yes.
nothing. In fact, if you made any money, you were banned.
You were, as the expression goes, doing your own thing.
Yeah, yes. And that was very much the concept. And minimal equipment.
Yes.
I remember that as part of the appeal for me in the 60s, and still is, which is why I still wear a 40-year-old watch and no fancy equipment.
But it was also, part of it was the political situation, that Americans were regarded by the Russians, the Soviets back then, as weak. And the Olympics had turned into this heavily political event. You know, we had medal counts and who won the most amount of medals, and the Americans were trying to prove their strength and whatever. And when Frank Shorter won in 1972, that was pretty much a turning point for it.
Frank Shorter appears to be running to victory, winning an unexpected gold medal for the USA. It's incredible. He seems to be just jogging in the streets.
I think Shorter really appealed to the American public because he made it look so beautiful. I won't say easy, but he made it look like poetry. And this was a sport that until then, its image had been suffering, grimacing, exhaustion, collapse.
It showed American strength. It was a political victory. And it reached right down and made the marathon acceptable, because Frank Shorter went to Yale. He was an Ivy League graduate, and he went to law school. He was someone you could admire, you know, middle-class values.
Yeah, Frank's contribution, I always think, is that he made, as you just said, he made the marathon the big thing, the big aspiration for everybody.
Yeah.
America had got into running before that,
Yes.
thanks to a great extent to Billy Mills, Native American Marine, and Bob Shaw, very much a middle class guy, not with exclusive education, university, but not with exclusive education or anything like that, winning gold medals in 1964.
And you left out Kenneth Cooper,
And yes,
who popularized jogging
Yes.
as a cure-all for
Yeah.
practically, you know, mainly for heart disease.
Yes.
And that became very popular in the 60s. Congressmen were jogging, and jogging had become popular. And if you jog enough, you get better at it and faster,
Yeah.
and eventually you might consider entering a competition.
The bit I hadn't come across before was your very perceptive point about the political implications of this in the Soviet versus America political scene, and the marathon became, America, as it were, appropriating the marathon. Of course, the Russians would be good, and certainly in the 1960s, the Russians were often favorites for the marathon. Popov, I remember, was one of the great Russian runners. And I think one was fourth in the 1960 Olympics because Barry McGee, the New Zealander, just passed him. America was nothing. You know, I wrote about Buddy Edlund. Nobody knew about Buddy Edlund, and they still, in a way, don't know about him because America was just simply not interested in the marathon at that date. So, really interesting perception there about the growth of the marathon as being both political, but also coming from Frank and the others, coming from that totally non-political world of just almost hippie. You know, Bill Rogers as the, and Amby, you know, Amby sometimes says, you know, the other students were doing drugs and rock and roll and things, and he did running. As you said, it was his thing. But it was all part of the freedom of expression of that era. Okay, so that's the, as it were, the social change that came into the marathon. And then let's talk about two other kinds of change, you know, racial and gender, because this is a story of increasing inclusiveness. Now, the racial one is something that I know you're particularly interested in, and you had a really good chapter as long ago as that book, you know, when you wrote it in '98, about focused on the New York pioneers. Tell us a bit of that story, how important it is, and where it might be going.
Right now, I think it is the most important thing that happened to the marathon. It was a black track club started in 1936 at the height of the Great Depression, at a time when Harlem was hit harder by the Depression than the rest of New York City, when Harlem parents usually both parents worked at jobs far from home, and children were unsupervised. And three men, one of them Joseph Yancey, started a track club for boys. Now, this was William Culbreth, Joseph Yancey, and William Douglas starting a track club. They were middle-class men. And what they were doing, it took me a long time to figure this out, and a lot of research at the Schomburg, where I still spend a lot of time. They started a track club, and the goals were education and integration and becoming a better person. Any boy could join regardless of ability. They were recruiting for the middle class, and that was the point. So it started on the sidewalks of New York with a group of middle-class men. And I have some quotes here.
Tell us.
This is from Ed Levy. Ed was a high school principal, and he was assistant coach after Joe Yancey. And he talked about the competition. Yancey used competition to expand his message. Sanctioned track and field meets call for proper deportment on the part of athletes. A track meet is a carefully structured occasion, and a milieu of propriety and formality surrounds the displays of bursting speed and strength. Athletics competition demonstrates the compatibility of manliness and restraint. Joseph Yancey was recruiting for the middle class. He was teaching what we now call the soft skills. And I have a quote from Ed Levy. Yancey did a lot of talking about being a gentleman first, and the values of sportsmanship and growing up to be good citizens. And much of the talking and teaching that we had every night was a lecture of some kind. And these are the topics that we covered, in addition to how to run, how to strategize your races, and so on. But a great amount of time was spent on personal development and subjects to that nature. So there was the emphasis on education, but they also, you know, they brought the boys in with the allure of sport. They emphasized education. They encouraged them to apply to colleges. And if they had an interview, they would pay for haircuts. They would buy the boy a new suit. They gave them, Yancey gave them the soft skills to succeed. It took us a long time to realize that the first person in the family to go to college was at risk. Now we know those students really need certain special attention. They knew it back then. And in my research at the Schomburg, I've found out this is the hallmark of the black middle class.
You're taking this work way beyond that particular chapter in this book, aren't you? And this is the next book, isn't that right?
Yes. As soon as I retired, Gary Corbett decided this was his opportunity to get me doing this work. But he's been wonderful. He has a whole organization going. I've been introduced to other scholars, and it's been a great encouragement.
And Gary is doing a tremendous job in leading both recognition of African Americans in the history of running, but also in building an archive and consciousness of the history of running in general.
What I want to say is what Yancey was doing was creating, remember, this was a working class event, and maybe it was the individuals were somewhat uncouth. Well, Yancey wouldn't have stood for that. So what he brought, as the members of the Pioneer Track Club grew older and entered the marathon, he brought a certain level of respectability to it. He made it a nicer sport.
Isn't this a wonderful kind of twist around from people's stereotypes, that here you have a group of African Americans coming into an activity and making it more respectable than it was? It's really fascinating.
Remember when, well, you do research too in a library. When you go there, the world is open. You can see, you'll find anything. I mean, the Schomburg is glorious. What I'm seeing, yes, I am doing what Gary wants me to do and researching the Pioneer Track Club. But what I am seeing is that the black middle class in New York City has made tremendous cultural contributions that haven't been acknowledged.
So this is running, history of running, which is then
I'm sticking with running,
a much bigger history.
I see much more than that.
Well, that, of course, is what I was trying to say throughout when running made history, which is my title, and saying exactly that in a whole series of different contexts.
Yeah. So I've been very busy. I mean, what I'm doing now, I know I've written this book, but you know, your eye is always on the next book.
Oh, yeah,
and so I'm overwhelmed with reading because I have to read about the black middle class. I have to read about the Caribbean immigration, which was a tremendous influence. And New York had this incredible, unique black middle class that was, remember, in the South there was land. So the middle class could establish their own residential enclaves, which would be segregated by economics as well as race. But in New York, you were so limited that the middle class was there and accessible. And that's why Yancey could do the work he was doing.
And they all show up every year to watch the Penn relays. So all the old guys, that's why I love going to that event, because you're always surrounded by middle-aged and elderly black guys who had this history of running in the Penn relays when they were 18. And this is part of their self-identification and their own self-narrative, as well as part of the social history of New York and Philadelphia and the whole of the East Coast. Fascinating stuff. And it still goes on, and still with the rivalry between USA and Jamaica at that event.
As far as Yancey was concerned, he also brought more people to running. Remember, in 1942, right after the threatened March on Washington that didn't happen, when Roosevelt opened government jobs to everyone, meaning that African Americans could no longer be discriminated against, Joe Yancey formally integrated the Pioneer Track Club. Before that, it was integrated. More and more white youth, they saw running, and they would tell each other in high school, there's a club where you can go and run with the men. And so more white kids would go. And in 1942, it was formally, on the table, integrated.
Over and over again in these conversations, you find that the history of running is much more.
Yes.
The last discussion I had was with Vince Chiappetta, and it involved, among many other things, the creation of the first gay running club in New York City. The front runners, and so we're on the same kind of territory. And let's move on now to the third kind of inclusiveness that I identify, that has a chapter in your book. You say that the first American marathon to have a women's race was Pikes Peak in 1962, when 4 women ran. And we all know that in the first of the modern New York City marathons in 1970, Nina Cusick ran, was ill, didn't finish, but so there was 1 woman at least started in that race, and then the year after, I think it was 4. Now, not quite with the marathon, women are almost equal in the marathon. In every other aspect of the sport of running, they are now in a considerable majority. What about that story, Pam?
Well, including women goes way back, and one of the first proponents was Browning Ross, who started the Roadrunners Club of America. Remember, it was a British idea, and it was to open up running for everyone. And Browning Ross, who began it, opened it up. Why not have women run? So every Roadrunners Club, you know, the AAU did not allow women to run the marathon. I think back then in the 50s, they couldn't run beyond 800, the 800 meters. And the Roadrunners Club, because they were not part of it, they were an organization that put on road races, allowed women in. And so women were permitted in the sport. They, you know, it could happen. As far as the increasing participation of women, I don't know how to say this and make it acceptable, but I think Catherine was a leader in that, not just the work she did later on in creating the Olympic marathon for women, not just that, but in the 60s and 70s. She was beautiful and glamorous. It was like the most popular girl in high school. If she did it, then it must be okay. And women would see this beautiful woman running the marathon. It made it okay.
Well, of course, being married to her, I'm not able to comment.
Yeah, I know we both know her.
Except to say that, as well as all of that, I know she worked really hard. There were plenty of women, well, not plenty, but there were other women who were equally significant as runners. Probably only Nina in New York and Jackie Hansen in California did as much work. Just licking stamps, you know, licking envelopes, organizing track meets, starting clubs, sitting on committees with a lot of boring men, smoking all evening, and all of those things. Because to make any change, you're not just, you know, the dynamic, charismatic figure. The work has to be done. And
I documented the work in my book,
and
so
Catherine,
everybody
and
has
to give
it.
her great credit, Nina Cusick in New York did a huge amount of that.
And Jackie Hansen.
And Jackie over on the West Coast. They're the ones I know best.
Yeah.
Sarah May, I think, in Sarah May Berman in Boston, probably. We've had some really interesting topics here, but let's take the last interesting topic, which is you. Now, you told us the story of going to Stanford with Amby and John J. Kelly, which meant you knew some significant people in the running world. You say in your book, before I was a historian, I was a runner. So tell us a bit about your story, Pam.
In the 1970s, I joined the Roadrunners Club because that's what you did. And back then, the offices were 2 rooms in the West Side Y, and Fred Lebo was right there. And I quite remember alphabetizing the 1977 New York City Marathon. What was unique about the experience was everybody was there and nobody was particularly special. So I got to know the older men, such as Ted Corbett. I didn't know them, but they were there. I knew who they were. I knew who Louis White was. I knew men who remembered that it had been a working class sport. In one chapter, The Visible Hand on the Foot Race, and that's actually been taught in sports marketing at Columbia University. I explained how Leibowitz, who was from the garment district, I'm sorry, we used to call him Leibowitz.
Yes, yeah.
He was
Fred
from
Lebo.
the garment district, knew about marketing, and he aggressively marketed it as an upper status sport. Look at Frank Shorter from Yale, look at Bill Rogers from Wesleyan. You know, this is the type of sport they do. But they would tell me it wasn't like that. And Joe Kleinerman, he had been a postman running in street races. And I just knew that it was a working class sport. I left college and worked as a nuclear medicine technologist and eventually wanted to finish my degree and went back to Bard to finish. And I had a wonderful advisor who noticed my interest in running. And we were talking about it. And he said, well, it's an upper status sport. And I said, no, it wasn't. In fact, you know, it was working class. And he had an article written by 2 Canadian academics that it was why it was upper status. I said, no, it was working class. As a matter of fact, the first president of the Roadrunners Club was African American. And so I think that got me started on this.
Did you run a marathon?
Oh, yes. I ran New York.
You haven't told us that, you see, which is what a lot of our viewers will be wanting to know.
Okay. I achieved a respectable level of mediocrity. Okay? That was my
That's better than most of us do.
My personal best was 3:25:22 at Long Island in 1979. I've run New York twice. I've run Boston. But I run because I like running, but I think I'm more important as a writer, as an historian.
Yes, you're at about 205 level as a historian.
Thank you. Okay, this show is including all of my fantasies. I've always dreamt of something like this, and just to be told I'm a 205, that's way out. Thank you.
I just want to end this discussion in an unexpected place for a talk about running. You've already mentioned it, the New York Public Library. And I want to do that partly because I was there this morning, and I don't get there as often as you do, but it's a very, very important, as well as you use the term, happy place. You actually quote another writer, Richard Mandel, as saying, "I shiver with awe when I enter its doors." Well, I didn't shiver this morning because I was so hot and sticky from walking through the streets of New York on this hot summer's day. But that is the place where you can actually access more running history than anywhere else in New York.
Than anywhere in the world, I'm sure. Well,
yes.
Right now, I'm working at the Schomburg, and I need to go up there more often. Now, one has family obligations. But the Schomburg Library, when I started doing research there this summer, I could barely work. I was so overcome with emotion, the riches of the Schomburg. It's just incredible. As for the New York Public Library, I lived there when I was writing this book. It was just extraordinary.
You're right about the depth.
I'm talking about the 42nd Street Research Library.
Yes, that's where I like the Lions.
Yeah.
But it's a wonderful library, and I've been working, among other things, on the 1928 Olympic Games and the women's 800 meters, the very controversial women's 800 meters. That's got all the newspaper reports you could possibly want. That doesn't mean to say you necessarily get the truth, but you find out what was being offered as the truth at that time. And when you say you get better archives there than anywhere in the world, that's probably right, though I would put the Berlin Marathon and Road Running Museum equal with it. And I want to mention that because I find it very disturbing, and I know our friend Gary Corbett finds it equally disturbing, that the only place that anyone in the sport now in the United States can really send archival material, letters, notebooks, journals, newspaper clippings, whatever they've got, there's nowhere to take it other than Berlin. And the great Dr. David Martin, one of the greatest historians in the sport, after his death, cartons of container loads of his stuff went to Berlin.
I wish it wasn't like that.
And it's very sad.
I mean, I've seen things I won't mention the institutions, but more than one, and you know who I'm talking about. Things are just stacked up, pages crack, things are not climate controlled. There should be a running archives.
We really need something. I wanted to take this opportunity to say Gary Corbett is working very hard to try and establish something.
Yes,
there are various other possibilities, like the new Marathon Museum in Hopkinton. Nothing developed yet, but it is very important. I say in my book, running has been too busy looking after its future to look after its past. But you can't keep on doing that, because the past, as we've been showing today, is very important. Otherwise, you get completely the wrong impression, as you described in your conversation with your mentor at university about whether marathon was an upper-class sport or a working class, etc. We've got to get those things right. We've got to get it right as to whether women did collapse in the 1928 800 meters, etc. We need to know these things in order to know what to believe and how to move forward from it and understand what went on. And I know Will likes to use this program for some propaganda for the Putnam County Park. and so I'm taking this chance to use it as some propaganda for our sport of running, to create an archive and to try and emulate and work with the New York Public Library, which does that job among its thousands, millions of other jobs extremely well.
So much has been lost already.
Yes.
The archives of the New York Pioneer Club were packed up in a box and lost. They were at the 369th Regiment Armory, and I can't find them. And I've been contacting people all over. I mean, it was the constitution of the club in Joe Yancey's own handwriting. It was there. I used it with Ed Levy. He was with me, and everything was in a box. It doesn't exist anymore. Where is it? And all of the information from, Joe Yancey's family, all of the artifacts. Right now, the New York Historical Society, at Gary's urging, they're going to mount an exhibit on the New York City Marathon, but at Gary's urging, they're going to go into the past of the marathon, especially the Pioneer Track Club, and we're looking for artifacts, and I don't know where they are. These things should be preserved, and especially all the information. The scrapbooks of the New York Pioneer Club should be in the public library.
So on that note, appropriate for a couple of activists from a few decades ago, wanting to move research forward and have the materials in which people can do their work. On that note, let's end this conversation with thanks to Will Sanchez for his always genial hospitality.
Oh no, I have to thank him for making my dream come true. This has been wonderful.
Well, that's good. I'm glad it was a dream, Pam. So thanks, Will Sanchez. Thanks to the Manhattan Neighborhood Network for their hospitality on this, and special thanks to you, Pam Cooper, for coming out and making your dream come true and doing it so articulately. And the very best wishes for the continuing important work that you're doing now on the whole African American question and their role in the great and important history of the marathon. Pam Cooper, thank you.
Thank you, Roger. It was such an honor to be on this program, being interviewed about my book, to be on Gotta Run with Will. It's wonderful. It's a dream come true. An academic author rarely gets this opportunity, and I am so grateful. Gotta run.
Always a pleasure to talk to somebody really interesting and who shares my passion for the history of running. Pamela Cooper today has interrupted her assiduous research for her next book in order to talk about her last one, The American Marathon, and a very important book it is, as I think our conversation showed today. Thanks, Will, for this opportunity. Thanks to Pam for coming out and talking so interestingly. And thanks to all of you for watching, and especially those of you who read my book, When Running Made History, which raises a good many issues similar to those that we've been discussing today. And we ended today with the issue of an archive for the sport. I urge that to your attention. And meanwhile, we've all got to run.